episode of Marketing Management and Money. I'm your host, Ryan Owens.
I'm your host, Ryan Murray.
This week, we will be diving into a financial concept of risk versus reward.
Oh, love it.
Yeah, this one's going to get spicy. So this has always been an interesting topic for me because I've had the fortunate position to be able to sit back and watch a lot of these things happen in different businesses that I've worked with and have learned a lot of things with what not to do, I guess, right?
Oh, it's so harsh when your best examples are bad examples.
Yeah, exactly. And so,
but you learn from them.
Exactly. And again, I've been fortunate enough to not have to tread these waters with my own money. But it's been great because knowing what I know and working with the people that I work with, it's been a really great opportunity for me to help some of these businesses avoid some of these terrible, terrible mistakes, what can be grave ultimately for a small business, right?
And what I've found through my experience is when you start talking risk versus reward, the businesses that get it, oh man, they get it, and it works well for them. The businesses that don't get it, they're like, risk versus reward. What are you talking about? I'm just like, oh, okay. This is in the 1930s there was a saying that it was interest. Dems that get it, dems that don't.
Yeah.
and it's basically saying that if you understand interest, it flows to you. If you don't understand interest, you're paying it out.
Yeah.
And
right.
So, as we talk about risk versus reward, how much are you risking to, start your business, run your business, keep doing your business day after day after day? And what is the reward that you're getting for that?
Yeah, and more so, a little bit further than that, it's more than just being aware of what risk you're taking. It's acknowledging and planning for the risk that you're willing to assume, right?
Yeah, you can calculate this.
Yeah, what risk are you willing to take on? What are you willing to lose? What are you willing to sacrifice or give up in order to reach this objective,
And so I'd like to, if I can kind of get into the numbers here for a second.
Sure.
I'd like to sort of spell out the risk versus reward metrics, and there really is a graph that's going on here. So if you picture on the one axis you've got risk, on the other axis you've got reward, and the concept is, as your risk increases, the reward should also increase. Now, usually this metrics is done in terms of percentage or return on investment percentage. And so if I take on risk, then the percentage of my money that I'm getting back from my investment should also increase. So let me put this into kind of some tangible steps so that our listeners understand what we're talking about here.
Please.
And I do have to apologize to some of our international listeners because I'm going to be using some very American examples. And so I know that these, this is basic finance stuff. And so the concepts are going to hold true regardless of where you are. But I apologize that I'm only going to be using the American examples because, well, that's where I live and that's what I'm familiar with. And so, so hopefully that'll be okay. So the first thing that I like to look at is I like to look at the, kind of if you have a certificate of deposit, a CD, all right? A CD is kind of considered risk-free. It requires no real education, no understanding, no time to manage.
Right.
You just put your money in and, you
sign for that specific term and
then you're going to get a return on that. But those returns are typically very low, 1%, 2%, 3%. You might be getting 5 or 6% if interest rates are high. You're not seeing those rates now, but
right.
I've seen where you get those kinds of rates off of a CD, but they're FDIC insured, and so you're saying, okay, at zero risk, I should be getting 3% off of my money.
Yeah.
And I get that we're talking entrepreneurship, and most people are like, well, I'm not looking to invest in a CD. But here's the thing. If your business is only producing a 3% return, then you are far exceeding the level of risk you should be taking for that amount of reward, because your business is risky.
Yeah.
You're risking your time, you're risking your expertise. A lot of times you've got collateral tied up in this. You might have your house on the line. You might have retirement funds tied up into it.
Personal relationships.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot more than just money involved in the risk here.
And so if I'm only getting a 3%, I'm like, well, wait a second. You could save yourself a lot of time, a lot of grief, and get that 3% using another vehicle.
Yeah.
A really easy vehicle.
Yeah.
And so as we move up this kind of the line on the graph, as it were, as your risk increases, so the next step that you would take would be a mutual fund. So again, mutual funds are considered pretty low risk. That's why people use them as a retirement fund, is because it's pretty much guaranteed. Well, a mutual fund, you're getting typically 8 to 12%.
Sure.
And so, but it's tied with the market. And so that thing's going to go up and down. A CD only goes up, but it only goes up at a rate of about 3%, whereas a mutual fund's going to go up at, a rate of 8 to 12%, but 1 year it might actually go negative. You might, so there's some risk.
Yeah, you look at your standard S&P 500 over the course of a couple of years, like 2 or 3 years, you may see some of that, high variability and look at that and be like, I don't want to go there. But you look at that over the course of 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it's pretty well established that you're going to get that return on it, right? It's like a CD in that sense. It's not quite as secure, not quite as sure. There is more risk involved, but
not FDIC insured.
Right. But there is still that long track record of you invested for this long, this is what you can expect to get out of it, kind of a thing.
So think about this for a second, okay? Let's go with, I'm going to just split the middle and put it at 10%,
Sure.
And
it's usually where I calculate it too.
So if I'm looking at, I can put my money into a mutual fund and I can get 10% out of that. So think about how much people will invest into their business. What if I need $100,000 invested into my business? Well, if I took $100,000 and put it into a mutual fund, at the end of a year, I should have $110,000 with, again, very little effort, very little risk, very little expertise. If I'm not hitting these kinds of numbers on my business, why am I doing it? I could take that same money, plug it into a mutual fund, and I'm going to be just fine, right? So as you move up that risk versus reward spectrum, the higher risk, the next level is just directly into the stock market. So you've talked about going into the S&P 500. We've talked about mutual funds. Well, what if I want to just invest in specific stocks? I'm no longer as diversified. Maybe I've excluded some bonds out of that. Maybe, the real estate funds, and I'm just going right after those stocks. Well, a good stock portfolio, you can get 20%, but all of a sudden I can lose all my money. I need to have higher expertise. It's going to take more time. So that risk is going up, and I'm starting to get higher returns where I would expect to see that 12 to 20%. It's kind of that next gap on that, on that spectrum.
And you say lose your money. Like, this isn't like you wait a couple of years and it's coming back. Like, it's gone. Like, this company crashed and burned and there's ashes and rubble strewn across the roadway. Like, it's not coming back.
Yeah. I mean, I've dabbled in some high-risk stocks where I'm just like, okay, I'm either winning big or, see you later. And oftentimes on those high-risk stocks, it's like, oh, okay, well, lesson learned, should not have invested in that one.
Yeah.
And so, the risk is going up. We expect a higher reward, and that's at about 20%. Now we're starting to touch where, in my opinion, an entrepreneur could consider, because I'm going to tell you, the risk that you have in your business is still higher than the risk you have in a stock market. Stock market,
Sure.
I've got all the prospectus, I've got all the history, I've got all these analysts, I've got access to tools. This is a known tool, a
Right.
known process, and I would expect to get 20%. So if I'm getting into my own business and I'm not seeing an ROI of 30, 50, 100%, why am I doing this?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. You're giving a lot of financial examples, but in entrepreneurship, you could go with a lower risk option. Just like how mutual funds are lower risk than stocks, in entrepreneurship, you could go with something lower risk, like a franchise.
Right. Something that you might pay a little bit more upfront to get into, but there already is that track record. It's already established. A lot of that risk is already trimmed out of it. They've shown that this is successful and that there is a map to implement and do this right, and it'll most likely take off. Right?
Yeah, and that's a really, really smart way to look at it. I would kind of say that franchises are sort of the equivalent of mutual funds, and starting your own business is sort of the equivalent of like the stock market. Like a mutual fund, it's established. You have a fund manager who presumably has already done their research, kind of put it together for you. A franchise, you have, the franchise owner who presumably has already done their research and put it together for you. Can I deviate for just a couple minutes on some interesting information about franchises?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So franchises have a higher success rate than starting your own business. And if any of you guys out there are listening to this podcast that are maybe wanting to get into business, you might want to look at franchises. Now, typically, you're going to pay, as you mentioned, you're going to pay a lot more for that franchise because part of what you're paying for is you're paying for their process. And
Their proven model.
Yeah, and so they're going to want to get a little bit out of their franchise fees, and they're going to want to make it happen, right? But you're getting some security. You're getting some, some comfort in knowing that there is a high level of success. And it's interesting. So franchises that have been around for 3 years or less typically have about a 50% chance of success. So if it's a pretty new franchise model, 3 years or less, you're looking at about a 50% chance of success. Franchises that have been around for 12 years or more, they can have upwards of over 90% chance of success because that model is so dialed in. They've got a long history. They've got lots of stores and demographics to pull data from. They know how to do this correctly.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times you'll see that with that fee that you're paying up front, they are going to offer you training as well, right? Like you'll fly back east or to the Midwest and do their university and come back and you know exactly what you need to do. They literally give it to you.
Right.
This is how you do it. And you do this, you can't mess it up.
Yeah. However, you've got to keep in mind, so they're going to do that training. They're going to tell you how to market. Now, here's a cautionary. So I had a lady, and she owned a franchise. It was a deli sandwich franchise, very well known nationwide, and she was in one of my marketing trainings. And as we were going through and talking about different marketing strategies, she started getting really frustrated. And I'm like,
okay,
what's the matter? And she's like, I'm not allowed to do any of this.
What?
Well, so the marketing was so dialed in that she was required to follow their marketing plan. And she was a little bit frustrated because she was trying to grow the business, but she wasn't allowed to. And you will oftentimes see within a franchise that they will require you to do certain promos, discounts, and you'll see this a lot in the restaurant area where you might have to discount below your food costs. And so you might lose money on the promotion, but they're still going to require you to do it.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of times those programs, those promotions or offerings, they come at a cost to the franchise owner, right, or the franchisee.
Yeah, yeah, and so the pros and cons.
Sure.
I'm not going to say that franchises are good or bad, but it's important to understand on this scale of risk versus reward that a franchise is going to be lower on the risk, which also means lower on the reward. You're not going to take home as much pay, typically speaking, right? There's always exceptions, but you're not going to take home as much because you've got to pay out for those, franchise fees. You've got to pay for what they are going to require. You've got to have, capital up front to get into the franchise.
Yep.
Quality franchises, oftentimes they have a wait list or, limited selection, But so lower risk, lower reward, owning your own business, higher risk, higher reward. And so that is a way to kind of mitigate if you're interested in entrepreneurship, but you're not quite ready to, just invest all of your life savings into an unknown concept. It's like, there's a lot of really good franchise options out there at quite a spread of capital investment. I was shocked when I started looking into how little it costs to get into. I mean, you can get into certain franchise models for under $10,000.
Yeah, I was gonna say a couple $1,000. Some of them are over $1 million.
Right.
It's insane.
Yeah. Over $1 million with a training, extensive training process. I was talking to a guy once. He was actually presenting at an entrepreneur series, and he was looking at getting into a franchise. He quit his 6-figure job to take this training program to own a franchise, and he's like, scariest thing I've ever done.
yeah I knew a guy that did that as well with a I'm going to say it's a burger chain. It's not the burger chain you're thinking of, but he did that with a burger chain, and same thing. So he had to quit this really prestigious job and leave his family and go do this training.
Like leave his family?
No, they didn't export him to Kazakhstan, but yeah, he had to go away for a couple of months to do this training and then come back and then get this thing off the ground. He said the same thing. He's like, it was terrifying.
Yeah, kind of crazy. So let's bring this in. I mean, we sort of deviated and talked about some franchises there for a minute, and I think that's some good information. But really, we're trying to hone in on this risk versus reward, this ROI.
Yeah,
and I think that there's something that we really ought to cover before we wrap up with this week's episode, and that is understanding that you can't fully calculate return on investment without understanding the concept of present value of cash flows.
Yeah.
And so let's take a second and let's just talk briefly, high level about present value. I mean, if you really want to get into this, there's a lot of great content out there, but we're going to just cover some essentials, some basics that you need to understand this concept and know that it's out there and it is affecting your business in terms of ROI.
Yeah, if this is something that, as we're talking and it kind of resonates with you, by all means, take a look into it because it can add some significant value to your small business in terms of your knowledge and being able to operate correctly, optimally. That's the word, operate optimally.
Operate optimally.
So
give us a definition.
Yeah, present value is just $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, right? So let me give an example. If you want to invest, say, $10,000 into your business and with the hopes of getting $20,000 in a year or so.
Sure.
That's a pretty good investment over the course of a year, right?
That's awesome.
So if you extend that same investment out and instead of getting that back in a year, you say you get that back in 5 years, then it's all of a sudden it becomes not a great investment because of the time that it took you to get that investment back, right? A lot of people think that the money is money and that, well, you're like, hey, I doubled my money, but you're not taking into account the time factor. And that's a really important piece of the concept of present value is that you need to take that into consideration because think of if you doubled your money every year over the course of those 5 years, you're going to be a whole lot more money than $20,000 at the end of 5 years, right?
Right.
And so when you invest in your business, you need to also take that into account. That's the concept of present value.
Right. And so when we're looking at this idea of risk versus reward, a risk factor is time.
Yeah.
How long am I going without my money? How long does it take me to get something out of my investment? And so it's really important, as you were talking about with, that present value calculation. And, you could get really technical and you can calculate present value. I mean, there's and the calculations aren't too hard. If you, your spreadsheet analysis will do it. Financial calculators will do it. I mean, shoot, your phone will do it. And so it's not hard to calculate, but it's not as important for you to do the calculation as it is for you to understand the concept behind it. And I think that's really all we want our listeners to know, is that the longer you're without the money, the more risk you're putting into your business. And because you're adding risk, you need to increase the reward.
Yep, absolutely. So with that, we're going to wrap up today. We hope you learned a lot. It was a great conversation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter at MMMSmallBiz. That's at MMMSmallBiz. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Okay, we'll look for you then.